My parents have asked my brother to take over my house because I'm single and in my early 30s. My brother, who is 29, has 4 children. He had his first child at 22, the second a year later, the third 2 years after that, and the fourth just a few months ago. His wife and I don't get along. She often tries to provoke me by acting superior, and when I respond, she plays the victim. She can cry easily and puts on a convincing show to gain sympathy from others. Despite knowing her true nature, my parents and brother admire her. Although she is attractive, her behavior makes it impossible for me to feel any attraction. She also chooses not to work, even though she has a college degree. My mother helps with the children daily, so my brother's family relies entirely on his income. This situation means they live with my parents, and privacy is a challenge in their small, outdated 3-bedroom house. Growing up, my younger brother was clearly the favorite. Despite being only 3 years apart, he developed a sense of superiority because I was often punished if I stood up to him. It was evident that my parents favored him, giving him most of what he wanted, unless other family members pointed out the favoritism. This led to my parents moving us about 150 miles away to limit family visits to holidays. During a 3-hour drive, my brother repeatedly physically abused me, relentlessly flirted with my first girlfriend until she broke up with me, and mocked any misfortune that came my way. Whenever I expressed my distress, my parents told me to suck it up. The only time I received fair treatment was when they wanted to maintain appearances. It was almost amusing to see their discomfort when they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and Christmas, especially with nosy relatives around who thrived on gossip and drama. My parents went to great lengths to hide the truth and even threatened to take away all my belongings if I spoke out. They seemed to celebrate when I turned 18 and moved out, as it meant they no longer had to support me. I wasn't even finished with high school when I left, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. Since then, I've kept low contact with them. They didn't attend my high school graduation, but I didn't care. From then on, I only saw my parents and brother during holidays, like the rest of the family. When the pandemic hit in early 2020, things took a turn for the worse. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job, leaving us unable to afford the rent on unemployment benefits. I was living in a 2-bedroom condo I loved, but as the lease ended, my roommate moved out early to live with relatives. I had to sell nearly all my belongings to avoid homelessness. I had rented a place that was too expensive, enjoying the high life until it became unsustainable. I had been living in a much cheaper area to save more money, but I had a plan. I owned a truck because I've always loved them. I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck, intending to live in it temporarily. However, I ended up staying far longer than I anticipated. Initially, I hoped to park the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family also live. When I asked my parents if I could stay there for a while, they told me they had a full house and didn't want me there, especially since we hadn't gotten along well in the past decade. They said they'd only allow me to park my camper if I paid them the equivalent of what it would cost to rent an apartment in my area, a fee that was far too high given my situation. I was unemployed and trying to stretch my unemployment benefits until I could find a new job. Given the high rent they were asking, it felt like I might as well have been renting an apartment. My parents called my camper an eyesore and insisted that I leave. They found it amusing that I was living in a camper, and my brother joined in the ridicule, calling me a homeless bum. That first night, I parked my truck and camper in a store parking lot. I was terrified that someone might try to break in, and I barely slept. With no other options, my other relatives lived far away, and all my friends were apartment dwellers. I had nowhere else to go. I was pretty attached to my area and didn't want to leave, so I had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment. That was the only way I could still receive it. Finding a stable parking spot for my camper was tough, and I spent months living a nomadic lifestyle while searching for a job similar to my old one. During that time, I dealt with a lot of challenges, from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding that I move because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone claiming to be with an HOA demanded I leave, even though I wasn't parked anywhere near houses. When I questioned which HOA they were with, they became aggressive and threatened me. I decided to move my camper to avoid further trouble. To ensure a steady supply of electricity, I used a long extension cord to plug into any available outlet I could find. This meant sneaking around and plugging into the outside outlets of random buildings while parked on the street. I know it wasn't ideal, but I needed to keep my batteries charged to keep my refrigerator cold. I had a small solar power bank for my phone, but no generator, which would have been noisy and required fuel. After months of this nomadic existence, I finally landed a new job in a neighboring city. I had been determined to avoid retail work again, despite nearly breaking that promise. Although I was still receiving unemployment benefits, I lacked a stable living situation and didn't want to be unemployed when those benefits ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind with little to do but read and watch movies on a small portable screen. I used my phone and laptop as a DVD player and kept track of parking options and local public bathrooms. I admired the Japanese public bathhouses and wished we had something similar here. When I landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse. The old employee parking spaces were so far out of the way that they were almost forgotten. My boss, who owned the company, actually appreciated this setup because it meant I was available for any shift as long as I got enough sleep. He even let me detach the camper from my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I wasn't sure if this was strictly legal, but no one ever bothered us. During my time there, I rarely had issues with trespassers. There were a few, but the security guards took care of them. I was on call almost all the time and worked virtually every day of the week. My boss allowed me to plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays, when the office was empty except for the janitor and security guard. Since the camper didn't have a shower and only a portable toilet, which I tried to avoid using because emptying it was a nasty job, I showered at a friend's apartment or at the local gym. I had a key to the warehouse and could use the bathroom there at any hour. I even became good friends with the night security guard, who is now one of my closest friends. The camper was easy to heat and suited my needs well. During the winter, I used a small electric heater to stay warm, and summers were tough since the camper didn't have AC. To make things more bearable, I bought a used portable air conditioner. I worked a lot of overtime, picking up new skills from my co-workers, and eventually, halfway through the year, I landed a better job as a supervisor with a higher salary. That's when I decided I wanted to buy a house. The scare of losing my condo made me realize I needed something more stable for the long term. I searched for a place close to work and found a 3-bedroom manufactured home just 2 miles away. I managed to negotiate the price down by $10,000 and used nearly all my savings for the down payment. I got approved for a home loan, and finally, I didn't have to live in the camper anymore. The new place had enough space for me to park my truck behind the house and set up the camper in the backyard as a separate little building, just in case I wanted to use it again. Once I was fully settled in, I made the mistake of bragging about my new home on Facebook. My family saw the post, and that's where things took a turn. A few weeks later, my parents, my brother, and his family showed up for an unannounced visit. I hadn't even given them my address, so I have no idea how they found out where I lived. None of my friends have admitted to telling them, and no family members had visited me before. I wouldn't be surprised if they followed me home from work or something. When I opened the door, they practically barged in like enthusiastic tourists and immediately made themselves at home. Everyone kept probing and giving me that unsettling smirk, which I later realized was intentional. It made me extremely frustrated. My parents constantly mentioned how much extra space I had now and suggested it was too much for someone like me, who has no wife or kids. My brother also noted how my house had more space than our parents and was closer to his job, raising several red flags. Eventually, my brother asked to speak with me privately. As soon as we were alone, everyone else left the room and gathered on the front porch. That's when I understood they had planned something. My brother suggested that the house was too large for just me and proposed that he and his family move in because his wife is expecting their 4th child and my house is closer to his job. He also mentioned that I could live in the camper while they used the main house. Notably, Dan never mentioned paying rent, even though he has a good job. He started discussing changes, curfews, and how I wouldn't be able to enter the house without prior notice. If Dan weren't my brother, I would think the person I was talking to had lost their senses. Dan's behavior had been influenced by our parents treating him as if he were the center of the universe. I tried to voice my concerns, but he talked over me as if my opinion didn't matter. There was no way I would rent my house or any part of it to him. I might consider renting to others to help with the mortgage, but definitely not to him or his disagreeable wife. I've seen this exact situation in videos online many times and was determined not to let it happen to me. I never thought I'd actually experience this because it seemed so absurd. But my parents, brother, and even now all fit the description of being narcissistic and entitled. So I grabbed my phone and started recording. Ben just held on to it, and Dan didn't seem to notice or care that I was recording. He continued to talk about why he needed my house, then acted like it was already a done deal and reached out to shake my hand. That's when I finally found my courage and said, "Hell no," loud enough to make Dan stumble back. I rarely raised my voice at him because our parents would punish me whenever I did, but this was my house, not theirs. I could stand up for myself here. I told him that my house was not up for grabs, and just because they wanted it didn't mean it would happen. I bought the house for myself, and it wasn't my fault he kept having more kids and couldn't afford to move out of our parents' place. Dan moved as close to me as he could without actually touching me and said I didn't deserve the house and that he needed a better place for his family. I laughed in his face and told him that was ridiculous because I worked hard to buy my house, so of course I deserved it. Dan then started yelling that I have no wife or kids and don't need all that space, so I might as well give it to him. I told him I wasn't giving him anything and he hadn't even offered to pay me rent. I'd still be covering the entire mortgage. Here's a revised version of your text. I couldn't even live in my own house because Dan insisted he shouldn't have to pay rent, claiming that his family came first. Our parents supported him, acting like their opinions were law. I argued with Dan, telling him they had no right to give my house to him. Despite this, he and my parents barged in, surrounding me and trying to force me to agree to their terms. There was a lot of shouting, and the phrase, "just do it for Dan," was thrown around more times than I can remember. During the fight, I told them they had no say in my life or my house and demanded they leave before I called the police. My mother screamed at me about being pregnant again and how I was being unfair. I told her she had no right to take from me and that I owed her nothing. I called her out for being disrespectful and made it clear I didn't care about her feelings or the number of kids she had. She wouldn't be living in my house. This angered her enough to lash out physically. She landed one good hit on my face before my brother intervened. She was kicking and screaming, insisting my brother let her go so she could attack me further. I recorded most of the incident on my phone and held it up, threatening to call the police if they didn't leave immediately. My parents eventually told Dan they were leaving. My mother then gave me a week to come to my senses, but I told her I wouldn't change my mind and instructed them not to come back. I told Sil the phone had recorded everything and warned her that if she tried anything, I'd press charges for assault. She screamed at me, then stormed out, crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one to leave and told me I better do this for Dan and Sil. I told her I wouldn't be part of their story. After kicking my parents, my brother, and Sil out for trying to force me to give up my new house, component placement, I immediately took to social media to share my side of the story with the entire family. The post spread quickly, but it's no longer available since I later made my profile private. I posted to preempt any attempts by my family to twist the narrative and paint me as the villain, which I was certain they would try. I had about an hour's head start and video evidence to support my version of events. Being proactive paid off, as I quickly gained support from several family members. My parents, Dan and Sil, must have planned to write their own posts, but it was too late for them to effectively counter my version of events. While they had a few supporters, many knew how entitled they already were and quickly understood and accepted what had happened. One person called me and ranted about how I was a terrible brother and needed to make way for a real family man. I ended the call and blocked the number, and that was the only such call I received. A week passed, and then my parents, along with Dan, showed up on my front porch as they had threatened in their previous ultimatum. They rang my doorbell repeatedly and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, but they tried to push their way in. Luckily, I had installed a couple of latch chains that held firm, and I braced my body against the door for extra security. My father and brother demanded that I let them in, but I told them I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they attempted to force their way in again. My mother then calmed them down and, in an overly sweet tone, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to leave and never come back. She started crying and asked why I couldn't do this for Dan, claiming he was my beloved brother. I laughed and told her I did not see him as a brother because he had mistreated me for years, and they had encouraged his behavior. I said they were terrible parents and he was a terrible brother, then told them to leave or I would call the police. Surprisingly, they left quite easily, though my mother was loudly crying and the others gave me disapproving looks. The ease with which they left seemed suspicious. I thought the issue was resolved, but later that week, on Friday evening, I came home to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. Dan and his family were moving their things in. He greeted me with a smug grin. I was furious and told him and his family to stop, but he insisted they were moving in, no matter what I thought. My mother, with a fake smile and tilting her head, said it was fine because Mommy had allowed it. I was seething with anger when I heard my mum's words and saw her smug expression. I locked myself in my truck to call the police immediately. Even as I was on the phone, she continued to pound on my window, insisting I stop and accusing me of being unfair because she and Dan needed the house. She cried, pleading, "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I shot back, "Dan? It's my damn house, not his." Then she threatened to key my truck if I didn't stop calling the police, all of which the 911 operator heard through the slightly open window. I warned her that if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her. Thankfully, she backed off when the police arrived. When the police and I got to my house, Dan, Sil, and their kids had locked themselves inside. I explained everything to the officers and showed them my new driver's license with my current address. At the front door, I discovered they had changed the lock. The old lock was lying on the porch, drilled out with a Harbor Freight drill and a full drill bit set next to it. I pointed out the broken lock and drill to the police and gave them a detailed account of what had happened. At that point, my parents arrived, having been called by Dan. They immediately started lying, claiming I had agreed to rent the house to Dan and his family. I told the police that was an easily provable lie. Dan and Sil eventually emerged from the house, looking smug and holding some papers. They had created a fake rental agreement, but it was missing my signature. There was one document, but it didn't resemble my handwriting at all. I don't think any of them have ever actually seen my signature, so it was incredibly foolish on their part. I told my parents and Dan that it was blatantly fraudulent, and that if the police investigated, they would quickly uncover the truth. I warned them that going to jail wouldn't benefit them and could even cost Dan his job, which is his only means of supporting his family. I also mentioned that I would hire a lawyer to sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or damaged, and that I'd call CPS to make matters worse. Dan went pale and looked genuinely scared when I said all this. My mother intervened and insisted that I should just do this for Dan and move into the camper so they could have a family home to themselves. I shouted back that if she thought it was such a good idea, she should do it for Dan herself and let him have her house instead. The police ended up separating us, and I demanded that everyone leave immediately or I'd press charges. I accused them of breaking into my house by drilling out the front door lock, and I made it clear that the lease papers were obvious fakes with a badly forged signature. I also pointed out that I had recorded video evidence of them attacking me. Felonies that could ruin their lives if I chose to pursue them. The only reason I hadn't acted on this already was for the sake of Dan's kids, giving them one last chance to get out. Once my parents heard this, it seemed to finally hit them that they couldn't force me to do anything for Dan. My mother backed down and said she would put an end to it. She then went over to talk to Sil quietly, while my father spoke to Dan. Sil immediately started crying and tearing up. In just a few minutes, the two cops on the scene were joined by two more, which seemed to give my parents extra motivation to hurry along. I demanded that Dan give me the keys to the new lock he'd installed on my front door. He was very reluctant, and instead of handing them to me, threw them down the street into a storm drain, telling me to retrieve them myself. One of the officers scolded him for that and made him retrieve the keys. Dan had to pull off the grate and got quite dirty in the process. When he finally handed the keys back, he grumbled and slammed them into my hand. I then told them all to leave and never come back. My mother responded by saying I'd be disowned for this, as if that was some kind of threat. I replied with exaggerated sarcasm, "Oh no, that means I won't get to join you for holidays, where I've always been treated poorly anyway. Dan has always been your obvious favorite, and you treated me so badly growing up that if he ever needs an organ, I wouldn't donate. So do like you always told me to do when I was mistreated and just deal with it." My parents were stunned by my response, and the 4 cops looked quite judgmental toward them. I found that confronting unpleasant parents in front of law enforcement can be particularly effective, as they're less likely to act out. My mother started crying and walked away. My father stood there looking like he wanted to hit me, and Dan held his kids in defeat. Meanwhile, Sil was throwing a tantrum on my front lawn. They all lined up, carrying boxes and emptying my house since nothing had been unpacked yet, making the process fairly quick. During the move, my mother repeatedly insisted that it wasn't too late to reconsider, offering various bargains to persuade me to change my mind. She suggested that Dan could pay me rent if I let them stay, and when that didn't work, she proposed that I move back in with them so Dan could rent my house. I told her to shut up and keep packing because I didn't want Dan or his family around. I didn't want his money, and I certainly didn't want to live with him or my parents ever again, especially after how they treated me as a kid. Making a deal with my parents felt like making a deal with the devil. My mother had another tantrum, throwing a box down and sitting on the floor for a pity party because she didn't want to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She stayed angry and sulking until the packing was done and even resisted getting up when it was time to leave. After they finally finished loading everything into the truck, I gave my parents one last tirade about everything they put me through growing up. With 4 police officers present, they could do little more than stand there and take it. I called them out on numerous issues, including how they never did anything kind for me, like letting me stay with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet, and how they allowed Dan to ridicule and belittle me. Well, who's the one in the wrong now? They wanted to evict me from my own house so Dan could live there rent-free. But when I needed a place to park my camper, they tried to charge me more than I could afford, even though they knew I was unemployed. The police gave me judgmental looks when I explained the situation. I confronted my parents again and asked them what I had done, other than being born, to deserve such poor treatment. It seemed that whenever I made some progress, they wanted to take it away from me to favor Dan, as if I should give everything to him and have nothing for myself. I bought my house with my own money. I owed them nothing, and I won't be asking them for anything ever again. Clearly they see me only as a doormat or a source of money. They had no answers and just looked stunned. I continued to question how they could think they were good parents after all this. My father was visibly embarrassed, and my mother was crying, admitting she felt like a terrible person. I told her directly that she was, and that they all were. Their behavior had been unacceptable, and if I addressed these issues privately, they would just get angry and act like I was at fault. Their denial had become part of who they are. My mother buried her face in my father's jacket, crying, while he looked more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Dan and his family stayed away. After they finished loading everything back into the moving truck, I made sure nothing of mine had been stolen, not that I had much furniture to begin with. The movers got back into their vehicles, glaring at me with hostility. Eventually, my brother managed to convince her to drive the minivan home. As soon as they left, I went online to share what had happened. My parents, too embarrassed to defend their actions, left the family divided before, but now it was a clear victory for me. Almost everyone sided with me after this incident, and those who didn't simply chose to remain neutral. Despite my parents' repeated claims that they did it all for Dan, no one was listening anymore. Their remaining support within the family evaporated. Many people I expected to side with me did, including the former enablers. It seemed they'd finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family at my new house for Christmas, but my parents weren't invited. Surprisingly, I wasn't blocked on my brother and Sil's profile, so I saw that Sil had her 4th baby in early November. They're still living with my parents, and it's clear they knew I was keeping an eye on them because Sil kept making passive-aggressive posts about the lack of space at my parents' house. It seemed like she was trying to guilt me into something. I'm sure this situation is driving my parents up the wall. With 3 loud kids, a mentally unstable Sil, my golden child brother, and a newborn all under one roof, they're probably not enjoying any peace and quiet. Maybe they should consider moving into a camper in their own backyard and letting Dan take over the house completely. It might give them the tranquility they're seeking. Here's a rewrite of your message with a more streamlined and polished tone. For those who suggested I should have just involved my brother and let him deal with things, I want to clarify why I didn't. My brother and his family are in a tough spot. They're parents with young kids, and if he were arrested, he could lose his job. Without his income, his family would be left without financial support, especially with their baby being only a few months old. Neither of them needs to end up in jail. Revenge isn't worth jeopardizing their stability. I got my payback without involving the police. Would I be this merciful again? Probably not, and they know it. I decided to wait until after the new year to create an account and share my story, just in case more events unfolded. As expected, they did. Previous readers will recall that my soul was posting passive-aggressive messages on social media, clearly aimed at me, especially after she had her 4th baby in November. Her posts repeated the same complaints about being tired of living with my parents and needing more space. I know I might sound dismissive, but after everything I've been through with them, it's hard not to respond with sarcasm. Since I waited until January to create my account, more happened, just as I anticipated. As mentioned before, I hosted a Christmas Eve party and invited half the family. Despite the long drive of about 3 to 4 hours, everyone came to support me. They praised my efforts in getting a house on my own and apologized for everything I had endured. Someone even asked why I didn't just take my camper. Instead of enduring months of near homelessness, I had to admit, somewhat sheepishly, that I was quite attached to living in this area. It offered me the best job opportunities, unlike my hometown, which has limited options in my field. I wanted to make my own way as much as possible, and fortunately, everyone seemed to understand. We moved on to a lovely party, the best I'd attended in years. Some relatives even brought CDs of fantastic Christmas music, and the Ray Charles album my uncle brought was my absolute favorite. His renditions of Christmas songs were unlike anything I'd ever heard. For a while, I could forget my past troubles and simply enjoy the moment. But of course, it didn't stay that way. About 2 hours into the party, my parents, along with my brother and sister-in-law, showed up unannounced. They walked right through the front door without even knocking, acting as if they belonged there. I immediately turned off the music and asked them to leave. They pleaded to stay, saying they had brought gifts. But before I could say anything further, one of my uncles stood up and shouted at them. He said they didn't deserve to be in my home or my life after what had happened months earlier, and several other relatives backed him up. This uncle, my mother's brother, had once been very close to her, but his feelings changed drastically once he learned about the issues between me and my parents. Even my elderly grandparents, despite their age, were firm in their stance. They told my parents that if they wanted to reconcile, it was far too soon, and they expressed their deep disappointment in them for the past year. For a long time, my brother was favored, but people were no longer deceived. They needed to genuinely treat me like a son if they wanted to be part of my life again. They turned to Dan and told him they were tired of his repetitive complaints and needed him to move on. They made it clear that my house would not become their new home. She reverted to her usual routine of feeling sorry for herself and complaining that she should be the one living here, not me. She sat down, upset, and said it was unfair that I had the house to myself while she, with 4 kids, needed more space and a better place to live. She just wanted a better environment to feel like a proper mom. In a moment of frustration, I pointed out that her parenting was lacking since she largely relied on our mother for childcare while she spent her days drinking, using her phone, or spending Dan's money. I even made a comment, though perhaps in poor taste, about being surprised her baby didn't get drunk from her breast milk due to her drinking. She was upset and asked if I was calling her a bad mom. I said that the evidence spoke for itself. If she wanted to afford to move out of our parents' house someday, she needed to use her college degree, get a job and learn to save money. Since our mother already took care of most of the childcare for my brother's kids, she would have time to manage things once her baby was a bit older. Here's a more streamlined version of the passage. He was screaming at me for yelling at his mom, insisting that she had painted me as the villain who made her cry and wouldn't let them stay here. My brother tried to intervene by pulling his son away, but other relatives jumped in, turning the situation into a full-blown family intervention against my sister-in-law and brother. The scene was chaotic. She was crying, the new baby was crying, her kids were crying, and even Dan looked like he was on the verge of tears from the verbal assault. He ended up sitting on the ottoman, where I keep shoes, by the front door, looking completely defeated. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze and couldn't manage more than a couple of words to me, especially with the house full of angry relatives ready to judge him. If they hadn't been there to stop him, I have no doubt he would have tried to pull another power play, like when he tried to take over my house months earlier. By this point, he was so thoroughly humiliated that both his and my parents' reputations were in tatters. All pretense had vanished. Eventually, my parents, brother, and the rest left in defeat, and the party resumed. We all avoided mentioning the earlier drama for the rest of the evening. Since most of the adults had been drinking, everyone stayed the night at my place, and I even offered some space in the camper to accommodate them. The camper had become a bit of a curiosity. My relatives had asked for a tour earlier, amazed that I'd been living in it for nearly 2 years. They had a lot of questions about how it was during summer and winter and so on. I was up before everyone on Christmas morning with a fresh pot of coffee brewing. I had coffee and took some ibuprofen to recover from the spiked eggnog hangovers a few of us had. I was actually complimented on being a much better host than my parents ever were, and we all agreed to do this again next Christmas. After Christmas, she finally stopped making posts that were clearly digs at me and deleted all the old ones too. However, just after the new year, she made a new post complaining about how she tried to convince my parents to get a camper like mine so Dan and his family could use the whole house as their family home. She was upset because my parents firmly rejected the idea, insisting that no one would push them out of their own home, especially not from their master bedroom. The post was only up for a few days before she took it down, and she hasn't posted much since. She loves to complain, but it seems like she's realized there's no point if no one is listening. Dan can't afford to move his family out on his salary alone, and if they end up expecting another child in the next few years, it wouldn't surprise me. Things have calmed down for me since then. I even invited friends over for a poker night. I'm terrible at poker because I can never remember the rules, but it was a blast. We had Whoppers from Burger King and just enjoyed ourselves, drinking beer and eating junk food like the grown men we are. I'm thinking of maybe trying to date someone around the summer. I'm not getting any younger after all. Fingers crossed that goes well. It now sits idle in my yard, and I admit there were days when I'd go out just to spend time there. I lived in it for 2 years, so it feels like a second home to me. Maybe one day I'll actually get to use it for camping as it was intended. I've never been camping before. My parents always thought it was a waste of time, so it would be a completely new experience for me.